All right, everyone, welcome back to the Keynesian perspective. In this second video, which is going to be shorter, I will just talk about a few final notes regarding, well, the Keynesian perspective and its implications. And we will start with something called the Phillips curve, which the textbook also talks about. In order to understand the Phillips curve, let's go back and look at this L-shaped or inverted L-shaped aggregate supply curve. Now, if you remember from last week when we talked about just the aggregate supply and demand model in general, we did not use this type of aggregate supply curve. We used a more rounded one. That more rounded one from last week is kind of in between the Keynesian and the neoclassical models. And let's look at it again for a second. So I'll turn this very, very Keynesian aggregate supply curve into the more rounded, more in-between one that we used last week. It was something like this, right, if you remember. So it's not quite as angular. It still gets the same idea across. You know, it's got a vertical side over here and a horizontal side over here. But there's no like hard corner in between them. Rather, there's more of a smooth transition. Arguably, this is a more realistic curve rather than just a hard Keynesian one with a corner. If we have this kind of aggregate supply curve, in fact, if this is what the real world is most similar to, if this is what it looks like, then of course there's no single corner where we would want aggregate demand to be. We still want to aim aggregate demand to sort of like be in between here somewhere, you know, not on the flat side and not on the vertical side, somewhere in between here, kind of like where the corner would be if there was a corner. But there's more leeway, you know, there's more ambiguity because there is no corner. It's just sort of like a smooth curve. Now this type of curve also gives us a more smooth trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you'll recall from the previous video, the angular, purely Keynesian aggregate supply curve, basically what that resulted in was that if we were anywhere other than the corner, we would either have unnecessary unemployment on the flat side. If the aggregate demand curve was sort of over here, then there's unemployment. Unnecessary, we don't need it. We should just go to the corner and get rid of it. Or if we're on the vertical side, we're going to have inflation. Again, unnecessary inflation. We don't need it. We should just go to the corner and get rid of it. So we either have unemployment, or we have inflation, or we're in the corner, in which case it's great we don't have either one of those. That's on the that's if we have this sort of like angular, very hard Keynesian aggregate supply curve. Now, I should correct myself for a second. When I said, that in the corner we don't have unemployment or inflation, that's not strictly true, obviously. In the corner we have very low unemployment and very low inflation. Not strictly speaking zero, just to be clear. But in any case, the corner is obviously the best point. That is where we want to be. We don't want to be anywhere else if the aggregate supply curve does have that angular shape. Now, if it has this more rounded shape, on the other hand, then there's more of a trade-off. There is no, single corner that is the absolute perfect place to be with the lowest unemployment and the lowest inflation, and that's where we want to be. Here, if we have this sort of like rounded shape, then we can say that we can have more inflation with lower unemployment, or we can have more unemployment with less inflation. And we can just sort of like choose where we want to be depending on where we put our aggregate demand curve, right? We can move it a little bit this way, and that would give us more inflation, less unemployment. We can move it a little bit this way, and that will give us more unemployment, less inflation. So there's this trade-off. This trade-off is represented with another curve, has nothing to do with aggregate supply and demand, it's just derived from this trade-off. And that other curve is called the Phillips curve. This is the Phillips curve. Again, notice, it is not an aggregate demand or an aggregate supply curve. The axes are inflation and unemployment, not price level and real GDP. Specifically, they're the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Now, what the Phillips curve is showing us is simply this idea that there's a trade-off. The economy, an economy like that of the United States, a capitalist market economy, according to the Phillips curve, which is derived from the Keynesian perspective, the economy is going to be at some point on the Phillips curve. whether it's like here, let's say point A, or here, point B, or here, point C. We're going to be somewhere on the Phillips curve. And depending on where we are, we're going to have more higher inflation, a higher inflation rate, or a higher unemployment rate, but not the other. If we go at point A, we have a high inflation rate, but a low unemployment rate. At point C, we have high unemployment rate, but low inflation rate. And point B is kind of in the middle. It's just sort of like trying to balance those two things. So the idea is actually very simple. There's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It is derived from this version of the sort of a more smooth, less angular Keynesian aggregate supply curve. It tells us we have this trade-off, which would imply, if indeed there is such a trade-off, and data shows that there is, although the Phillips curve can shift, and that can, over the long run, that can change the trade-off. But in the short run, at least, there seems to be such a trade-off. So if there is such a trade-off, if this model is correct, then governments, by choosing where to put the aggregate demand curve, by choosing to shift it to the right or to the left, can also choose whether we're going to have more inflation or more unemployment, or if we're going to try to sort of like strike a balance between the two. So in other words, we can drive unemployment really low, but at the expense of causing inflation. Or we can drive inflation really low, but at the expense of causing unemployment. That is what the Phillips curve is saying. Again, this is a model, which may or may not be an accurate representation of reality, and economists actually argue about that, but that is what this model is saying. There's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We can drive one very low at the expense of allowing the other one to rise. Or we can try to strike a balance between the two, somewhere in the middle. That's pretty much all there is to it. That's all that the Phillips curve is about. As for putting numbers on it, that would depend on the country that we're talking about, the decade that we're talking about. There are all sorts of conditions that would impact what numbers actually go here. But the idea is that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, and by the way, in case you're wondering, the perfect Keynesian aggregate supply curve looks like this, right? Angular. A more moderate, as it were, Keynesian aggregate supply curve looks like this. And a neoclassical, a perfectly neoclassical short-run aggregate supply curve would look like that, sort of like a diagonal. So you can think of the Keynesian model and the neoclassical model as being sort of like two extremes of, regarding what shape the aggregate supply curve is. In the extreme Keynesian model, it's angular like this. In the extreme neoclassical model, as we will see next week, it's a straight diagonal like this. In a sort of like combined synthesis in between model, it's going to be some version of this curve in between. And the closer the curve gets to a pure diagonal, the more neoclassical the model is. The closer the curve gets to this angular thing, the more Keynesian the model is. So we actually, between the two extremes of the perfect neoclassical and the perfect Keynesian model, we actually have a range of possibilities. And it's all about the shape of the aggregate supply curve. The shape of the aggregate supply curve will actually determine how important the aggregate demand curve is. If it's angular, aggregate demand is very important. If it's not, then as we will see next week, aggregate demand may not be that important. Okay. So the shape of the aggregate supply curve is arguably the difference between Keynesian and neoclassical models. And from that, we derive the importance of shifting aggregate demand or not. But more on that next week. For now, let's talk briefly about the issue of policy, Keynesian policy. What are the implications of the Keynesian model? If this model is correct, or if it's, no model is absolutely correct, of course, if this is the best model, if this is the closest thing to reality, again, nothing is going to, especially no simple model like this is going to be a accurate, perfect representation of reality. But if of all the different models that we have, this is the closest, the Keynesian model is the closest to reality, what does that mean? What does that tell us regarding what we should do as a country, what our government should do? Let's think about it. So the Keynesian model, the Keynesian perspective, is saying that because the aggregate supply curve is like that, or maybe in a more moderate version like this, because of that, the thing that really matters, the thing that really determines where we stand in the economy is, in fact, the other curve, aggregate demand. And that aggregate demand can easily be shifted to the right or to the left by all sorts of factors outside of anyone's control. And if it shifts to the left, it can get stuck there. We can get stuck in a recession or depression for forever, or at least for a very long time, for years certainly, as we did in the 1930s. And that the way to avoid that, and also the way to avoid getting stuck in an inflationary gap on the other side, if that ever happens, the way to avoid that is through government policy. And government policy should aim to get the aggregate demand to be somewhere in the middle, to hit that corner if we believe that there is a corner, or at least to hit this sort of part of the curve if we believe that it's more like a curve. That's the Keynesian perspective. Now, you might think, from what I just said, and a lot of people do think, that the Keynesian perspective is a basically left-wing perspective because it keeps talking about government action, government intervention. We're talking about government policy, using government policy to fix the economy when there's something wrong with the economy, especially when we are in a recession. But it doesn't quite work like that. Because when we talk about government policy to move aggregate demand, to shift aggregate demand, we don't necessarily mean increased or decreased. We don't necessarily mean changes in government spending. That's certainly one type of government policy that can shift aggregate demand. Government spending is a type of spending. The government can buy things and thereby shift aggregate demand to the right. It can sort of like increase demand because the government is demanding stuff. And in fact, Keynes himself, John Maynard Keynes, recommended that in the Great Depression. And the book talks about that, how he recommended, of course, that governments should use this opportunity, the Great Depression, to increase their spending on useful things. Schools, hospitals, roads, etc. But he also said, kind of jokingly, that if you don't want to do that for some reason, then you could spend money on anything as long as you spend money on something, and that will help bring the country out of the Great Depression, or any other recession for that matter. So he was making the point that what matters is spending. Of course, if you're going to spend anyway, you might as well spend on something useful, but if for some reason you don't want to do that, then spending on something useless will also count as spending, also count as demand. But anyway, so government spending is certainly a policy that can be used in the Keynesian model to get aggregate demand where we want it to be. And Keynesians that are focused on government spending as the thing to use would of course be left-wing, left-wing Keynesians. But there's also the matter of consumption. If you want to shift aggregate demand to the right to get us out of a recession or a depression, you can increase government spending, certainly. You can also, however, try to stimulate consumption, or for that matter, investment, private consumption and private investment. You can try to stimulate private consumption by cutting taxes. So actually cutting taxes to get us out of a recession, cutting taxes to stimulate the economy is also a Keynesian policy. Increasing government spending is a Keynesian policy. Cutting taxes to get us out of a recession, to improve the economy, is also a Keynesian policy. So you can be a right-wing Keynesian. You can be a Keynesian who wants to cut taxes in order to shift aggregate demand, to the right, because cutting taxes would put more disposable income in people's pockets. So hopefully they would then use that income to buy more stuff. And by using that income to buy more stuff, that would shift aggregate demand to the right and help improve the economy. Cutting taxes impacts demand. So if you're an economist who believes in cutting taxes, you believe in that because you believe that aggregate demand is important. So you are at least partially Keynesian. And then, of course, there's investment. Government can also stimulate investment using something called monetary policy, which has to do with the money supply. We'll talk about that near the very end of the semester. And that's usually kind of neither left nor right, it's kind of centrist. Also, arguably, it's not as powerful in stimulating aggregate demand as taxes or government spending are. But it's a useful tool if you only need small shifts in aggregate demand. So we'll talk about that, monetary policy. That's what the Federal Reserve does. So you have different policy tools to shift aggregate demand. It doesn't have to be government spending. What defines the Keynesian perspective is the belief that the government has the power, has the ability to greatly impact the economy, for better or for worse. The government can do nothing in a recession, and then that's a terrible idea. Or the government can increase spending or cut taxes, depending on what side you're on, or maybe you can use monetary policy as a compromise. But either way, the point is that what the government does or doesn't do has an impact, has a big impact on the macroeconomy. And also, change is constant. Aggregate demand is unstable, and this impacts the economy a lot. There's a lot of change going on in the economy, and the government should respond to that change through policies that can be left-wing or right-wing. But either way, you as the government, we should respond to what's going on in the economy by changing government policy. We might want to increase spending to get us out of a recession. Then once we're out of the recession, we should stop increasing spending or maybe even cut it back so as to not go too far and get an inflationary gap instead. Or if we're currently experiencing high inflation, we might want to actually use contractionary policy, increase taxes, for example, or cut spending to get us into that corner. So the Keynesian perspective, although it does tend to be generally associated with the left in the popular imagination, is really about change and the importance of government action or inaction for that matter. The Keynesian perspective is saying that changing your policies in response to what's going on in the economy, increasing taxes or decreasing them, increasing government spending or decreasing it, changing monetary policy, this is good. You, as the government, should always be on top of things, should always be ready to change what you're doing in response to what's going on in the economy. There is natural change, a lot of it, in the economy, and you, the government, should respond to it in various ways. And again, there are left-wing and right-wing ways to respond to it, but the point is change. Change happens, can be good if you respond to it correctly, and the government should be ready to juggle, to shift its policies, to make changes accordingly. Change is natural and important, and it is very good for the government to change its policies as needed. That is the Keynesian perspective. It is about change and the necessity and inevitability of change more so than it is about either left-wing or right-wing. Now, as we will see next week, the neoclassical perspective is opposed to the Keynesian perspective because it is about stability. The neoclassical perspective says the economy is actually pretty stable by itself, and fluctuations will sort themselves out after a longer or shorter period of time. And government policy of any kind, whether increasing or cutting taxes, increasing or cutting government spending, in the neoclassical perspective, government policy actually can't do very much to help or hurt the economy for that matter. So in the neoclassical perspective, what the government should be doing is picking a certain type of policy, high taxes or low taxes, high spending or low spending, and stick with it. The neoclassical perspective is about stability. Just pick something, whatever it is that you want to do, and then just keep doing it, you as the government. Just keep doing that thing. Don't change too much. If you're going to change it, then change it only a little bit, then only gradually, not too much. That is the neoclassical perspective. So the neoclassical perspective, as we'll see next week, is about stability. And the Keynesian perspective is about change. Now, in the context of the United States, stability, keeping things the same, not rocking the boat, not changing too much, is or has traditionally been associated with the right wing. And this idea of change, of switching things around, has traditionally been associated with the left wing. So we tend to think of Keynesian policies as left wing and neoclassical policies as right wing. In a different country, in a country that already had high taxes and high spending, then a neoclassical policy might be seen as left wing, because the neoclassical policy would be saying, keep doing what you're doing. So if what you're currently doing is having high taxes and a big government with high spending, and the neoclassical side is saying, just keep it that way, don't rock the boat, don't change too much, then you could have left-wing neoclassicals. So you could have left-wing neoclassicals who are telling you to stay where you are if you're already in a left-wing country. You can also have right-wing Keynesians who are telling you to cut taxes. So while the neoclassical side tends to be associated with the right in the US and the Keynesian side tends to be associated with the left in the US, those are not very exact associations. Really, the Keynesian perspective is about change and the importance of change and how change is good and or inevitable at least. The economy is constantly changing, and you as the government have to respond to that and keep aggregate demand where it belongs. That's the Keynesian perspective. And the neoclassical perspective, as we will see next week, is about stability. You as the government, don't worry too much about it. The economy is going to fix itself more or less. Your job is to ensure confidence and continued confidence in the future. Make sure that people feel like they know what's going to happen in the future by keeping things stable. That's the neoclassical perspective. Keep things stable, don't change too much. Versus the change-based Keynesian perspective. All right. I hope that wasn't too confusing. We'll be talking more about this next week, obviously, and when we get to the neoclassical side of this. So, with that, I hope you have a good week, and I will see you next time.